The quiet panic. You guys have been absolutely flooding my messages asking for more GPS horror stories. And I finally found one that's going to mess with your head in ways you can't even imagine. This story came from a delivery driver who stumbled across something so disturbing that he still can't sleep properly at night. And honestly, after hearing what happened to him, I completely understand why. It was supposed to be just another typical Tuesday night shift for Marcus. He'd been driving for one of those food delivery apps for about 8 months, mostly working the evening hours to make some extra cash while he finished up his associate degree. The money wasn't amazing, but it paid the bills, and he genuinely enjoyed driving around the city listening to podcasts and music. Plus, the flexibility meant he could study during the day and work when he wanted to. That particular night started off completely normal. Marcus had already completed 6 deliveries without any issues, making decent tips, and was feeling pretty good about how the shift was going. The weather was perfect for driving, not too hot, not too cold, and traffic was surprisingly light for a Tuesday evening. He was actually ahead of schedule and thinking about maybe calling it an early night when his phone buzzed with what would become the most terrifying delivery request of his entire life. The order itself seemed innocent enough. Someone had requested Chinese food from a restaurant he'd picked up from dozens of times before. Nothing unusual about the items, nothing weird about the special instructions. Just a standard order for General Tso's chicken, fried rice, and spring rolls. The delivery address was in a part of town he'd been to a few times, though not frequently. It wasn't the nicest neighborhood, but it definitely wasn't the worst either. Just your typical suburban area with older houses and narrow streets. Marcus accepted the order, picked up the food from the restaurant, and punched the address into his GPS like he'd done thousands of times before. The app calculated the route and he started driving, following the familiar blue line on his phone screen. The first 15 minutes of the drive went exactly as expected. He was cruising through well-lit neighborhoods, stopping at red lights, making the usual turns that the GPS was directing him to take. But then something started feeling off. The GPS was taking him down streets he'd never seen before, even though he thought he knew this area pretty well. The neighborhoods were getting progressively darker, with fewer streetlights and houses that seemed more spaced out. Marcus figured maybe there was construction or an accident somewhere, and the GPS was just routing him around it. Technology isn't perfect, right? Sometimes these apps take you on weird detours to avoid traffic or road closures. 20 minutes into what should have been a 15-minute drive, Marcus started getting genuinely confused. The GPS was still confidently telling him to continue straight, but he was now driving through an area he'd never been to in his entire life. The houses were getting older and more run down, and there were long stretches where he didn't see any other cars or people walking around. The whole area just felt abandoned, like everyone had moved away years ago. Marcus checked his phone to make sure he'd entered the address correctly. He had. He even tried refreshing the GPS app, thinking maybe there was some kind of glitch. But the blue dot showed him exactly where he was, and the route was still directing him forward. According to the app, he was only 3 minutes away from his destination, so he decided to keep following the directions and see where it led him. That's when things got really weird. The GPS told him to turn left onto a street that barely looked like a street at all. It was more like a narrow dirt road with overgrown grass on both sides and tree branches hanging so low they were scraping the top of his car. Marcus had to slow down to about 10 miles per hour just to navigate through all the vegetation. His headlights were the only source of light, and they were casting eerie shadows that seemed to move and shift as he drove deeper into what felt like the middle of nowhere. The delivery app was still showing that he was getting closer to his destination, but Marcus couldn't see any houses anywhere. Just trees, tall grass, and that narrow dirt path that seemed to go on forever. He was starting to think about turning around and calling the customer to let them know he couldn't find their address. This whole situation was getting too bizarre, and he was beginning to feel genuinely uncomfortable about where the GPS was leading him. But then, just as he was about to give up and turn around, his headlights illuminated something in the distance. There was a house. It was set way back from the road, almost hidden behind a cluster of old oak trees. The structure looked like it had been built decades ago and hadn't been maintained very well. The paint was peeling, several windows appeared to be boarded up, and the front porch was sagging on one side. But there were lights on inside, so someone was definitely home. Marcus checked his phone one more time. According to the GPS, this was definitely the right address. The blue dot was positioned right where he was parked, and the app was telling him he'd arrived at his destination. He grabbed the bag of Chinese food from the passenger seat, took a deep breath, and started walking toward the front door. The closer he got to the house, the more unsettled he felt. There was something about the place that just didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was the way the windows seemed to flicker with inconsistent light, or how the front yard was completely overgrown with weeds and dead plants. The whole property had this abandoned feeling, even though someone had clearly ordered food and there were lights on inside. Marcus climbed the creaky wooden steps to the front porch and knocked on the door. He waited about 30 seconds, but nobody answered. He knocked again, this time a little louder, thinking maybe the person inside just hadn't heard him the first time. Still nothing. That's when he noticed something that made his stomach drop. Through one of the windows that wasn't boarded up, he could see into what looked like the living room. And what he saw inside that house was something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. There were people in there, but they weren't moving. They were just sitting in chairs and on the couch, completely motionless, like mannequins positioned around the room. At first, Marcus thought maybe they were sleeping or watching television with the volume turned down. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light coming through the window, he realized something was very, very wrong with this picture. These people weren't just sitting still. They were sitting perfectly still. Nobody moves that little, not even when they're sleeping. There was something unnatural about their posture, like they'd been arranged rather than having sat down on their own. Marcus felt his heart rate starting to increase as he stared through that window, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. That's when he heard it. A sound that made every hair on his body stand up. coming from inside the house, barely audible but definitely there, was a rhythmic ticking sound. Not like a clock or a timer, but something else entirely. Something that sounded almost mechanical, but with an organic quality that made it infinitely more disturbing. The ticking seemed to be coming from multiple sources inside the house, creating this layered rhythm that was both hypnotic and absolutely terrifying. Marcus stood there on that porch, Chinese food still in his hands, listening to this bizarre symphony of ticking sounds while staring at these motionless figures through the window. That's when one of them turned their head and looked directly at him. Ush! Marcus stumbled backward so fast he nearly fell off the porch steps. The person who had turned to look at him wasn't moving in any normal way. Their head had rotated slowly, mechanically, like it was being controlled by something else. And their eyes, when they locked onto his, were completely vacant. Not just tired or unfocused, but genuinely empty, like nobody was home behind them. The ticking sound was getting louder now, and Marcus could hear it more clearly through the thin walls of the old house. It wasn't just one or two sources anymore. It sounded like dozens of individual ticking noises, all slightly out of sync with each other, creating this chaotic rhythm that was making his head spin. And underneath all that ticking, he started to hear something else. A low humming sound, almost like someone was singing a lullaby. But the melody was all wrong. So Marcus wanted to run. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to drop the food, sprint back to his car, and get the hell out of there. But he was frozen. The person in the window was still staring at him, and now their mouth was opening and closing slowly, like they were trying to say something, but no sound was coming out. That's when Marcus noticed the thin wires running along their neck, disappearing behind their collar. He blinked hard, thinking maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him in the dim light. But when he looked again, the wires were definitely there. And as his vision adjusted even more, he could see similar wires on the other motionless figures in the room. They were all connected to something, like puppets waiting for someone to pull their strings. The front door suddenly creaked open, even though Marcus hadn't heard anyone walking toward it. A woman appeared in the doorway, and at first glance she looked completely normal. Middle-aged, wearing a floral dress with a pleasant smile on her face. But something about her movements was just slightly off, like she was concentrating really hard on appearing natural. "Oh, wonderful, the food is here," she said. But her voice had this weird sing-song quality that didn't match her appearance. "I was just telling everyone how hungry we all were. Come in, don't be shy." Marcus held out the bag of Chinese food, hoping she would just take it so he could leave. But instead of reaching for the food, she stepped aside and gestured for him to enter the house. "Please come inside for just a moment. I need to get your tip from the kitchen, and I'd hate for you to wait out here in the cold." It wasn't cold at all. The night was actually quite warm. But Marcus found himself nodding and stepping through the doorway before he could stop himself. The woman's smile never wavered, but up close he could see that her eyes had the same vacant quality as the person who had looked at him through the window. The inside of the house was even more disturbing than what he'd glimpsed from outside. The living room was filled with people of various ages, all sitting in different chairs and positions, all completely motionless except for the occasional slow turn of a head or blink of an eye. The ticking sound was overwhelming now that he was inside. It seemed to be coming from every person in the room, like they all had mechanical clocks hidden somewhere inside their bodies. "Everyone's been so excited to meet you," the woman said, still using that strange sing-song voice. "We don't get many visitors out here. Most people can't find us, you know. Their GPS systems don't usually work properly in this area, but yours did, didn't it? That's very special." Marcus tried to speak, but his throat felt completely dry. He managed to croak out, "I should really get going. I have other deliveries to make." The woman tilted her head to one side, and Marcus heard a distinct clicking sound like a joint popping. "Oh, but you just got here, and everyone's been waiting so patiently. Look how still they're sitting. They've been practicing." That's when Marcus realized what the ticking sound actually was. It wasn't coming from inside the people in the room. It was coming from devices attached to them. Small metallic objects that looked almost like pacemakers, but they were visible on the outside of their clothing, blinking with tiny red lights in rhythm with the ticking sounds. "What are those?" Marcus whispered, pointing at one of the devices. The woman's smile grew wider, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Those help them stay calm, help them sit still, help them wait. We've been waiting for someone like you for such a long time, someone whose GPS actually works in our little corner of the world." Marcus felt his legs starting to shake. He needed to get out of this house immediately, but the woman was now standing between him and the front door. And all the motionless people in the room were slowly turning their heads to look at him, their movements accompanied by those horrible clicking sounds. "I really need to leave," Marcus said, his voice getting stronger as his fight or flight response finally kicked in. "My manager is expecting me back, and if I don't check in soon, they'll send someone looking for me." The woman's expression didn't change, but the ticking sounds in the room suddenly got faster and louder. "Oh, that's not a problem at all. We can call them for you. Let them know you'll be staying with us for a while. We have everything you need here. Food, shelter, and soon you'll have one of these lovely devices to help you relax." She held up a small metallic object identical to the ones attached to all the other people in the room. It was blinking red and making that same rhythmic ticking sound. That's when Marcus ran. He shoved past the woman, ignoring her surprised yelp, and burst through the front door. He could hear chairs scraping behind him as the previously motionless figures started getting up, their movements accompanied by a symphony of clicking and ticking sounds. Marcus sprinted across the overgrown yard, branches and thorns tearing at his clothes as he crashed through the vegetation. Behind him, he could hear footsteps, but they were wrong somehow. Too rhythmic, too synchronized, like a group of soldiers marching rather than people running. He reached his car and fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get them in the ignition. The engine started on the second try, and he threw the car in reverse, not caring that he was probably destroying the undercarriage as he drove over rocks and fallen branches. As he backed down that narrow dirt road, his headlights swept across the front of the house one last time. Every single person was now standing on the porch, perfectly still again, watching him leave. But the woman in the floral dress was holding up her phone, and Marcus could swear he saw her taking pictures of his license plate. The drive back to civilization felt like it took hours, even though his GPS showed it was only 20 minutes. Marcus kept checking his rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights following him. But the road behind him remained dark. When he finally reached a well-lit gas station, he pulled over and sat in his car, shaking and trying to process what had just happened. He called the delivery app's customer service line and tried to explain the situation. But how do you tell someone that your GPS led you to a house full of people with ticking devices attached to them? The representative was polite, but clearly thought he was either lying or having some kind of mental breakdown. They eventually agreed to mark the delivery as undeliverable and told him he wouldn't be penalized for not completing it. Marcus quit his delivery job the next day. He couldn't bring himself to trust his GPS anymore, and every time his phone made any kind of notification sound, he would jump. But the worst part was that he kept having this nagging feeling that they were still looking for him, that somehow his GPS finding that house wasn't an accident at all. 3 weeks later, Marcus received a package at his apartment. No return address, no delivery service logo, just his name and address written in neat handwriting. Inside was a small metallic device identical to the ones he'd seen in that house. It was ticking softly and blinking with a red light. He threw it away immediately, but that night he could swear he heard ticking coming from somewhere inside his apartment walls.